Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
So I turn this on. And I say, hi, my name is Mary Gray, and I'm a senior researcher at Microsoft Research, and I'm here to introduce Sean Walker, who is a PhD intern here at Microsoft Research for the summer, and he's going to talk with us about Occupy and their use of Twitter. Sean, take it away.
Well, thanks, Mary. Oh, thanks, everyone. Thanks for coming. Thanks for getting up early to show up. Although I did bring cupcakes to sweeten the deal. So, as Mary said, my name is Sean Walker. I'm a PhD student at the University of Washington at the Information School. I'm also an intern here at the Social Media Collective, so I've had the honor to do that. And so my talk is Pizza Generators Intense Resource Allocation by Occupy New York City via Twitter. So I'm going to be talking about kind of resource allocation within a social movement and how social media was used to possibly kind of enable that. But first I want to talk about my motivation or why I want to talk about this. So one is that I had access to some specific resources here at Microsoft, being the access to archive of the Firehose, which is kind of all public tweets, and I'll talk more about that. So that was a pretty amazing opportunity. Also in Twitter, and I'll talk about this in a second, is that there are actually artifacts that are left behind whenever people post and tweet. So sometimes on the ground there were discussions, there were meetings, there were email lists, and those were things that I wasn't privy to and a lot of other researchers weren't privy to. So by studying Twitter and other forms of social media, there are actually kind of artifacts that were left behind that we can study after the fact when it happened. And also this connects really well with my interest in social media and political participation. So, so those are kind of my personal reasons, but more formally, social movement theory and resource mobilization theory really focuses on resource mobilization in kind of bounded organizations. So, for example, maybe a political party, maybe a union puts together a protest or puts together, or some formal organization, like maybe the Sierra Club, puts together this kind of protest and takes all these resources that are required, you know, setting up the space, signs, notifications, those sorts of things. And these existing organizations kind of mobilize it and take on some of the costs and help to get those resources. So I'm interested in what happens whenever you don't have an organization that's as bounded as, say, a political party or an organization like the Sierra Club. What happens when you have more like a loose confederation of camps, for example, like Occupy, that's global across many cities. And some researchers have been kind of moving away, so you think about the work of Lance Bennett or Jennifer Earle and trying to understand that. So that's one of the other motivations. The other is that there's been a lot of maybe bravado or excitement, might be a way to put that, around this kind of idea of the social media revolution. So I don't know if any of you watched Jon Stewart, but he had a great skit a couple months ago about what caused the revolutions to happen in Egypt. And so there was the big debate of, was it the speech that George Bush gave, was it the speech that, and the alliteration that Obama used in 2009, or was it someone was tweeting, so that's what caused this to happen. And then at the end the joke is someone comes in and says, well, maybe they're responding to 30 years of rule and some possible local conditions. So I think that the discussion around the role of social media in social movements is more complex than what we've seen. And sometimes it's successful and sometimes it's not. And then the other is kind of one of my favorites here. So this is my little angry Twitter bird. The other is to kind of understand, how do we get all of this data and get at what we actually need to or want to understand. So how do we get to the place where what tweets are related to Occupy, what Facebook pages are related to Occupy? How do we understand that? How do we go through those 300 some odd million tweets every day and figure out which ones are relevant? And so there's some methodological issues that stand behind that. So now I want to talk a little bit about Occupy and the movement itself. So this is a map that a colleague of mine made from the University of Washington, Joe Eckert. And we collaborated on this, and what we were doing is we collected data from Meetup.com, so Meetup is this website. You can go to it, say kind of what your interests are, and you can join, think of it as meetups or clubs or places where people are going. And so Occupy used this, and there's actually an Occupy Meetup page, and it listed all of the Occupy camps, and people could kind of join the camp and have discussions or also understand when events were happening. So this was done in early October, and you'll see each of the circles represents a camp on that page, and each of the size of the circles represents how many people had joined that. So this is kind of a proxy to give you an idea of, in the United States, in the middle of October, what did Occupy look like? Because that was something that was really hard to get at, of how many people were in each of the camps, how many people were participating. So this is just to generally give you an idea that, one, this is happening all over the country. There are certain concentrations, and some camps, so for example, Occupy New York City my geography is going to fail me. So Occupy New York City on this coast, there we go, how's that for safety? And then you have, my home Seattle, and then Portland, which there was an interesting rivalry between Portland and Seattle of which was the better Occupy camp. And then you move down the coast there. And then you see in the middle, not as much. So that's kind of boots on the ground in the camp, or maybe a proxy for that. But the other question is, so this movement, this Occupy movement, why would I actually look at social media? What's my rationale for that sort of activity? So here's another network graph that was made by a colleague of mine that we worked on. And what this shows is, so again in early October, we took a collection of Occupy-related websites. So for example, Occupy Seattle had a website, Occupy Portland, Occupy New York City, and the pattern continues. They also had Facebook pages, they had Twitter accounts, those sorts of things. So what this graph shows is you see what are each of the websites linking to. So Occupy Seattle had a link to maybe Occupy Wall Street, had a link to Occupy New York City, had a link to Occupy Portland, for example, or maybe some tweets. The size of the circle, or we call them nodes, represents how many times a website linked to them. Okay, and so you see the largest presence there is Twitter. Then you see kind of second largest is Facebook, and then third and fourth, pretty close tie, you see the blogging platform WordPress. And then Occupy Together, which is kind of an inter-Occupy coordination site where it kind of lists information that's happening between the camps and those sorts of things. So what this shows is that basically social media is a kind of locus of activity for the movement itself. So I think that's one of the reasons why I focused on this. But I want to kind of digress for a second and talk a little bit about data and where data comes from. So I focused on Twitter, and I focused on the hashtag, and I'll talk about that. But before I do that, I want to say, well, how do you actually get data from Twitter? So there are kind of three methods to get data. So from Twitter, you use something called an API, which is, for those that at the party tomorrow night, we can talk about this. Application Programming Interface is what that stands for, so now everyone knows. And basically, this is a way for programmers to connect to and applications to connect to Twitter to get data. And you kind of have a way to ask it questions, and then it gives you data back to its set of specifications. So there are kind of three main flavors, so to speak, or they call them kind of hoses. So there's a very big water theme in Twitter. So you have something that's called the search, the streaming, and the fire hose. And you get the idea with the icon there. So the search API, you basically send a query, and then up to 200 tweets will come back. Okay? And those tweets can be from anywhere from the last, this moment all the way to the last 9 days, up to that. But you don't know whether it's from 9 days, how far back you can go. It all depends upon what that server that you're querying has and it knows about, how popular the topic was, how much was in its cache or its kind of reserve of tweets. Okay, and there are limits on that. So you can only get maybe 600 to 6,000 tweets a day, depending upon the search terms that you're using and those sorts of things. So there are lots of restrictions. Then the middle is known as the streaming API. So the search API, you can kind of go back historically. The streaming API, you get data in real time. And you can get anywhere from 1%, or if you've been given special permission, you can get up to 10% of whatever's currently happening in Twitter right now. So of the kind of daily 300 million, whatever's happening right now, you can get anywhere from 1 to 10%. Without special permission, it's 1%. And you get those in real time, meaning you can't go back historically. So you send a list of keywords, they match certain things, and then kind of tweets rain down on you, and then you collect those. And then the final one is the kind of mythical unicorn of the Twitter universe, which is known as the fire hose, which means you just kind of think about standing in front of a fire hose, and that's how much data you get. You get every single public tweet. Okay, so all of these are public tweets that haven't been deleted. So every single public tweet that hasn't been deleted. and you get all of those tweets in real time, and you have to ingest them all. Okay? So for the purposes of my work, I was able to have access to Microsoft's archive of that fire hose, so all public non-deleted tweets are going to be in that set. Okay? So this is really kind of complicated, and there's varying levels of access depending upon who you are, how much money you have, and those sorts of things. Okay? So for my work, I focused on, in the archive, I focused on the hashtag, the needs of the occupiers. Okay? So a hashtag has a pound symbol in the front, and then it has some series of letters and words, and this is used as kind of a marker inside of a tweet, and it has kind of specific affordances or features. So you can click on a hashtag or search for a specific hashtag, and it can act as kind of a marker so you can find information of interest. It's a way for you, when you add that to your tweet, that might bring you into an existing conversation that's already happening. It's also a way for information sharing, and it's also a way for you to figure out where like-minded individuals are. So for example, the hashtag Occupy Wall Street was used in the beginning of the Occupy movement. It was kind of shortened eventually to OWS, because a tweet only has 140 characters in it. So that means every character that it takes up, that's one less character that you can actually write. And so if you add OWS to your tweet, that hashtag, then that means you're kind of joining that conversation, and people that are following that hashtag will see that tweet. So that's a way for you to kind of bridge different groups, and for you to kind of your tweets to go out to people that you might not necessarily know. And the hashtag needs of the occupiers was used starting in the beginning of September. It's still somewhat in use today, and some of the camps kind of tweeted it to ask for certain resources. So I'll talk about a couple examples in a minute. And different camps used it in different ways. So what I did is kind of my first step was I went into the archive and I got access to all of the non-deleted public tweets that contain that hashtag. Okay? And that was a lot of tweets. We're talking in the thousands. And so the next step was to kind of visualize it and to understand kind of what was happening. So what this is besides something that's probably really small and you can't see it. So this is a network diagram. And what this shows is kind of mentions and hashtags. So what I did is I took each of the tweets that had that hashtag in it, and then I looked for kind of the occurrences of cities and mentions. So mentions, they have a kind of an @ symbol, and you put kind of a name of the account on it. Hashtags, remember you have that pound symbol, and then you have whatever the text is that you want. And both of these are kind of ways of calling out something, of saying, hey, I'm part of this group. Or, for example, if I wanted to tweet Mary, I'd put @MLG. I'm not sure, is that your Twitter? Oh, great, sorry. And that's a way for me of kind of calling out Mary. If I put in a hashtag, maybe social media collective, that's a way for me to kind of calling out that I'm either speaking to or speaking about. Okay? So what I did was, this network is where you'll see the links are between Twitter accounts that are basically talking to each other or talking about each other. So I treated hashtags and I treated mentions as this kind of the same thing, because they're both ways to call out. So you'll see things start to cluster. So you'll see these clusters here are Occupy Wall Street, Occupy Wall Street NYC, which are kind of synonymous with the camp in Zuccotti Park in New York City. You'll see there's some other clusters. So you see Occupy Chicago down here at the bottom. You see Occupy Denver up here at the top. You'll see Occupy LA over in this cluster, and then Occupy New Jersey down here. And then, of course, probably everyone's favorite here is Occupy Boston up there at the top. So after kind of analyzing this data and seeing where the clusters were, I decided that I should focus on Occupy New York City as the kind of location of study. So one, because different cities used this hashtag in different ways. So if I took 3 different cases from 3 different cities, I might not be able to compare. And there are some other sorts of issues. And also because this is kind of the locus of a lot of that activity, so there'd be more tweets to look at kind of look at that practice and try to understand how do they request resources, were there kind of any responses, how was that propagated, and was there any sort of coordination? So I ended up with 3 separate kind of case studies that I took from that, the sample of the archive. So the first was from September 18th to the 20th, and this is kind of affectionately known as the Occupy, if you get the pun. It was a phenomenon where people were ordering pizzas for the Occupy movement from local pizza restaurants. And a local pizza restaurant actually created a very specific kind of Occupy, which I'll share in a minute, so I'll show you. We'll keep the suspense, okay? So that was from, so what I did is for each of the, so I took the day of the event and I gathered tweets before and after the day of the event, okay, just to kind of account for time zones and other sorts of things. So I ended up with 205 tweets in that sample. And then I looked in the end of October, the fire department, New York City Fire Department, came into Zuccotti Park and they took the generators and the fuel, saying that it was a health and safety hazard. So I was looking at what happened, how did Occupy New York City request resources in response to kind of an external actor coming in and kind of messing with their existing resources, okay? And so from that, it was October 29th, the 27th to the 29th, and there were 116 tweets in that sample. So both of these, remember, came from like the sample of the entirety of all tweets with the hashtag Occupy, the hashtag needs of the occupiers. So then I did a third thing, and from the needs of the occupiers sample, I went through and tried to look for keywords that might indicate whenever something was related to Occupy, and also keywords that might indicate that there is a request for resources. Because I was curious about what happens, so what is a hashtag used for, but are there kind of resource allocation discussions that are happening that aren't using the hashtag, and are those different? So this is kind of a methodological question. So I came up with, so I looked for tweets that had the words OWS and Occupy, okay? And then they also had to have one of these words, such as need, donate, pizza, looking for batteries, generator, socks, books, camping, equipment, bring, clothes, or clothing. And then these kind of match. So need would match needed, donate would match donated, bring would match bringing, and those sorts of things. So what I ended up with was a lot of interesting noise of about 137,000 tweets, okay? And that's from, and what's interesting, so I found things like, I need to see my grandmother so I can have something to occupy my time. I'm bored, so I need a goldfish to occupy my time. So I found a lot of tweets like that. So this is kind of one of the struggles. And traditionally what happens, most researchers that have been studying Twitter and looking kind of at a specific event, especially for kind of qualitative research, if you're doing large-scale machine learning, they kind of ingest trillions of tweets and then process them. But especially when you're doing some hand coding, researchers will use a hashtag as their kind of filtering mechanism, because that basically kind of simplifies it, and you could assume that that's related to the discussion. And then you don't end up with, so if you remember the numbers on the previous slide, those numbers were much lower than the 100,000 sample, right? So, so how was I going to deal with this 136,000 tweets? Since I was only here for 12 weeks, I can't code 136,000 tweets, and my mentors would be really unhappy. Believe me, I tried. And so what I decided to do is also time-bound and location-bound the sample that I was going to code from this 137,000 tweets. So what I did was I looked for Occupy New York City, so look for occurrences in NYC, just like I did in the previous set. And then I time-bound it so I could compare the generators example with the non-hashtag example, right? So as a result, I ended up with 387 tweets to code instead of this 137,000, which was a little bit more manageable. So since my questions revolved around how is Occupy using this hashtag to coordinate request resources, coordinate, propagate, and are people responding, I developed a coding scheme that I would use for each of the tweets. So first is I was coding for whether something was a request. So for example here, this tweet, rumor has it, Occupy New York City, police are blocking water supplies to our camp. Could some good Samaritan bring water? So you see this is an example of a request for water. So someone has a specific request, they mention OccupyNYC, so that's why that tweet falls under the request. Okay. So the other was kind of looking at propagation. So you see at the beginning of this tweet is this RT, which stands for retweet. So whenever you retweet something, it comes into your stream and other people will continue to see that. So that's kind of a form of passing on information. There are a couple ways to do that. You can type RT at the beginning of a tweet. You can press a button in the Twitter interface that retweets something. You can also use via or MT as shorthands for that. So the idea of propagation was I'm taking an existing request and I'm continuing to pass it along. So then the other was response. So this was, has someone actually filled a request or said I've sent something to the camp, and could I find any evidence of that? So this example, someone sent gloves via UPS to the camp, which I think was pretty cool. I didn't really expect anyone to be using UPS. So UPS became part of the kind of resource allocation strategy for Occupy. And then finally, I also looked for coordination. So coordination could be coordination of resources. Okay, bring these resources here now. Or but it could also be kind of informational coordination of, let's use this hashtag to coordinate a discussion. Let's have a discussion at this location. We're meeting here to do such and such. Okay? So coordination is both coordination of where and when to bring the resources, but then also kind of informational coordination too. So just if you forgot in the last 10 seconds about how much stuff I did, those were kind of the 4 coding categories. So if we look at each of the cases, this is the Occupy case, and this is the infamous Occupy pizza. And don't worry, the vegetarians were not left out. They used bell peppers instead of pepperoni for the vegetarians. So that kind of warmed my heart. So again, this was the middle of September. So you see, of these 205 tweets, 10 actually were requests. 88 tweets propagated that request. There were 48 responses. There were 13 tweets for coordination, and 44 times was that kind of coordination was propagated. So most of that coordination was in the form of use these hashtags. So let's start to kind of rally around the hashtag needs of the occupiers. This is when that hashtag actually appeared, is during this case. And then the responses were pretty interesting because many of the responses were kind of, I sent pizza, you should send pizza too. And then after a while, they got sick of the pizza because they were sending about $2,800 worth of pizza a day through Liberato's Pizza, which was one of the kind of one of the main Occupy pizza joints. And so there's like, stop sending pizza, stop sending pizza. So let me give you a couple examples of what this looks like. So you'll see, so this is a response here. They sent 5 pizzas from the pizza at Liberato's, which is a pizza place, with instructions to deliver to the protesters at the camp. And then another example would be, here are 10 pizzas that were ordered in the last 10 minutes. And this actually came from Occupy Wall Street NYC, their account. And they're saying, basically, we appreciate the pizzas, but it's starting to rain, and that sucks. So can you send us some rain gear instead? So it's interesting how there's an idea of not just, let's request pizza, but there's also this idea of, the pizza is great, but we also need this too. So basically, they're trying to kind of take this stream of pizzas and maybe convert this into a stream of another item that they need. Okay? And you also notice that these are all kind of things that they need that are new. Like, I don't have pizza, so I need pizza. We have pizza now, so now what we need is rain gear. Okay? And then, so another example, and another attempt to say stop pizza. So hot pizza last night was great, but it was kind of, basically we slept without blankets and sleeping bags, and now that's what we need. So again, another example to kind of a combination of a response, but then actually a request for a new item inside of that, okay, to kind of celebrate and thank that. So then, so the next example here was the generator raid when the firefighters came in. So there were 5 kind of original requests. There were 109 cases of that request being propagated. And then there's 1 response, which was actually not to the generators. The response was, I sent you gloves, in this case, right? There were 2 examples of coordination, which were also unrelated to the generators. And that should be a 0, but there are no kind of examples of propagation of that coordination. So in contrast to the pizza example, you see that there are a lot of requests, a lot of kind of people propagating those requests, and then that's kind of all we see evidence of inside of Twitter. So this was kind of the original tweet that started it all, of saying, we need replacement generators. The New York Police Department took all our generators, even their biodiesel. They were very much wanted biodiesel, not regular diesel. That was pretty explicit in many of the tweets, by the way. And so this was retweeted 75 times in the next 24 hours. And then that's kind of all the evidence that is shown in Twitter, is basically, here's this request for a generator. A lot of people said they need generators, and then the kind of activity around that stops. Okay. So in the kind of non-hashtag tweets, and by non-hashtag, I just want to remind you, it doesn't mean that the tweets don't have hashtags in them, but the search term that I used was not the hashtag itself. It was that keyword list. So this was 387 tweets. Okay, there were 9 requests. There were 82 kind of propagations of that request. There were 2 responses, again, unrelated to a generator. There are 9 tweets for coordination, and then they propagated that 51 times. But what's really interesting here is that in the previous 2 examples, I saw they were requesting new resources, again, I said. So we need pizza, we need generators. This is something that we don't have. But in this case, something popped up is, that's actually the wrong tweet. So what actually was supposed to pop up is there's a tweet where they, so Occupy Oakland around this same exact time, so this October 28th time frame, or 27th, the Occupy Oakland camp was raided by the police. And this is when the veteran Scott Olson was hit in the head with a flash bomb. So they basically kind of dismantled the camp, Occupy Oakland, and in solidarity with Occupy Oakland, Occupy New York City kind of floated a proposal at their General Assembly to send $20,000 and 300 tents across the country in support. Okay? So this appeared in Twitter, and so there's kind of this coordination of this idea of inter-camp kind of coordination. And I'm not suggesting that Occupy is this one monolithic movement and then just their basic cities. The cities are actually independent. And so there's this coordination between these independent camps in these cities. And so this appears inside of the non-hashtag tweets and kind of points to the utility of the hashtag itself. So the utility of the hashtag, and I'll talk about this more in a moment, is that it seems that they're requesting kind of new resources that the camp doesn't have. But what we see if we kind of look outside of the hashtag and what surrounds the hashtag is actually this idea of we have existing resources, now we're trying to coordinate those existing resources. So there's also discussion about whether Occupy NYC should actually send this $20,000 in these tents. And then finally, this was approved at the GA meeting, the General Assembly meeting at the camp. And there wasn't any evidence in Twitter that the money was sent. So I kind of went offline and online and sent some emails, looked at the financials. I actually emailed the financial committee at the Occupy New York City camp. And about 20 minutes later, they sent me an email back and said, yes, the money was transferred on this day. And then I went to the Occupy Oakland camp and kind of looked around their website, other things. And there were some press releases. About a couple weeks later, there was a transfer of funds to a Wells Fargo bank account. With one of the members of the Occupy Oakland camp, and there was a lot of press and some drama about that because, you're using the banks that you're actually you have issues with is probably a nice way to put it, and but it's really difficult to set up the infrastructure to set up a bank account. I mean, so we are Occupy Oakland. Well, what identification do you have that you're Occupy Oakland? Have you registered with the state? All those sorts of things. There are all these requirements to set up a bank account. So, and you can't just take $20,000 and put them in someone's personal bank account because then, so if Occupy Oakland gave me the funds, I could then spend them and they couldn't do anything about that. So it was actually set up in a trust at Wells Fargo, and then eventually once Occupy Oakland set up their own accounts, that money was transferred. So the evidence is this actually took place and was used by Occupy Oakland. So I'll go back to kind of talking about some conclusions. So. So one of the roles is kind of, the question is, so what's kind of successful and unsuccessful? Because I have two examples here we see examples of success inside of the Occupy pizza example. So we can see actually the whole entire cycle. We can see the initial requests for pizza, we can see propagation of those requests, we can see coordination, and we can also see people responding and saying, I gave pizza, and then there's evidence of that. There's evidence of people took pictures of the pizzas that they received and kind of thank yous with notes and with pigeons sitting on occupying pizzas. And it's not to say that because in the generator example we don't see a response, it's not to say that was unsuccessful. Because remember, this is one of many communication mediums that were used by the camps. So maybe there's an example on their Facebook pages. Maybe this took place outside of social media. Maybe this took place within, kind of a text phone tree or an actual phone tree, picking up a phone, talking to people within the camps. But also I think it's interesting to think about what type of kind of ask you have. So what does it mean to ask for a pizza? And what does it mean to ask for a generator? And how does kind of one deliver? And how does that connect with the existing infrastructure that's already available? Okay. So if we go back and think about what was happening before Occupy, we might think of the Wisconsin protests against Governor Scott Walker's bill. So this is one of the local pizza joints in Madison, Wisconsin, Ian's Pizza. It's from their Facebook page. So this is their running total of how many pieces of pizza and pizzas they sent to the Capitol and from what countries they were ordered. So I don't know if you can count as quickly as I can, but this is 69 countries, all 50 states, the District of Columbia, So they delivered 8,000 pizzas consisting of 64,000 slices. Okay, so so besides this is kind of beautiful art and very cool, this actually kind of primed. This might act as kind of a priming factor. So you might think of, well, we sent pizzas to Wisconsin, and Wisconsin actually sent pizzas to Occupy New York City. That group, that was kind of a big deal in the beginning, and this kind of spurred a lot of this sending pizzas. But the other is there's a connection with existing infrastructure. So these pizza places were there near Zuccotti Park before the occupation on the 17th of September. Okay? So they could plug into that, pick up the phone, call one of the local pizza places, okay? And you can send instructions. Click on this link that will send money to this pizza place, and then this pizza place will send money, send pizza to us. The pizzas were about $15 and 18 inches, if you care to know. So there's this connection with local infrastructure. Now contrast this with trying to ask for a generator. So how would one get a generator, okay, and have it delivered? So now if they started maybe a Kickstarter campaign to fund the generator, that might fit in with this idea of kind of existing infrastructure and also kind of social media. The other is, so what does it mean and how easy is it to give a pizza? So if I give you a pizza, what does that mean? I feel like there's some meaning, and I'm still trying to kind of articulate that, and what it means to kind of feed and clothe someone versus what it means to give someone a generator. And also, how many of us have generators at home? And how many people in Manhattan probably have generators in their very large studio condos or apartments, right? Where would one store that? I'm not sure where the closest Home Depot is, but so that might be kind of problematic. So two other things that I've been thinking about are this idea of kind of audience and locality. So for a request for a generator, someone might see that, say maybe you're located in Denmark and you might want to support Occupy. So do you kind of see that request and go, well, a generator, that seems like something I would have to do locally, and that kind of passes. You're like, okay, we'll pass that on. Okay. The other is maybe I'm in Denmark. I don't know why I keep using Denmark as an example, but I might see the pizza and it says, call this number, click this link, press this button, and then I can do that. Okay. And that also fits in with this idea of kind of threshold and the norms of social media. So if we think about maybe some of the arguments about maybe clicktivism or political participation just by clicking, we also think about the norms of social media. So you kind of have this idea of this, it's a very low threshold environment, that it's really easy for you to get into the environment. It's kind of, you have these kind of low threshold forms of activity that don't take a lot of effort, and then you can kind of exit. So think about maybe clicking a like on Facebook versus signing up to vote. Think about how much work that takes and effort. Or so think about that in the case of the pizza. Clicking on the link for pizza versus kind of a generator. All that, the generator request didn't plug into existing infrastructure. It didn't say, go here to help us do that. The request said, we need a generator. Versus pizza said, go here to order the pizza. So it kind of, it gave people a path to follow, but it also gave people this kind of infrastructure they could connect to. The same thing with donation requests. Donation requests were go to this PayPal site, which is, I think, another form of existing infrastructure. So this sets up kind of this idea of like you have this idea of a repertoire of activity that's already been set up by Wisconsin, and then you kind of connect this into kind of social media, and you give someone kind of this whole path from, I see this request, I understand how to fulfill it if I support it, it's really easy for me, and then it kind of happens. Okay? And it doesn't require them to be near the park in order to fulfill the request. So if you want to deliver socks, you probably have to deliver socks. A generator, how do you get the generator past the police too? Because they just took it away. It's not like the police are going to say, let me move out of your way so you can bring the generator past me, that's great. We'll be back in about 20 minutes to take it, thank you, right? So the other thing that the other conclusion is thinking about what the hashtag is used for versus what surrounds the hashtag. So one question is who's participating in the hashtag, who's aware of the hashtag, okay? So we might think of ourselves as, oh, well, hashtags, and we use them all of the time, right? So not everyone using Twitter is part of that practice. Also, hashtags are user-generated. So that means there's not this kind of repertoire structure that you can kind of fit in and go and ask, okay, so I want to talk about this in Occupy. So I go look on this dictionary that's kind of translation of hashtag to discussion. That doesn't really happen. These are kind of emerging, and these are changing all the time. So we saw cases of, so you have the idea of Occupy Wall Street, with street spelled out, S-T-R-E-E-T, transition to Occupy Wall Street, S-T, then transition to OWS. And this kind of also, this happened over time. you'll see that certain city sites used different resources, but they also kind of moved around and used different resources over time. So, for example, Occupy Seattle used Twitter a lot, then they kind of transitioned to Facebook and their blog, and then they transitioned back to Facebook. So there's these kind of intensities of use that changes over time. So how do you understand that? And also, once a hashtag is established, does this become part of an infrastructure that can be used to easily locate requests, to easily join a conversation? So thinking of it as kind of like the virtual pizza place, right? So once the hashtag's established, if you want, and you figure out that it's there, you know, kind of like Google Maps for hashtags, or Bing for hashtags, I'm sorry. You can just kind of join the discussion with kind of this low threshold just by using that hashtag. And also, what I found in the cases, which was interesting, was that the hashtag was only a discussion about we don't have this resource when we need it. And then there was no kind of discussion of we already have this resource and here's what we're going to do with it. So then, and it was for a specific city versus the kind of discussion surrounding the hashtag and the non-hashtag data. There was a discussion of existing resources and the coordination of existing resources too. So if I just focused on the hashtag, I would have missed that conversation around existing resources and the coordination. So there's a cost. So there's a utility and an ease for researchers when we use this. There's also a cost, which is what I'm going to talk to you about now. So the other is that so there are methodological limitations. So there are technical limitations in can you program, can you sort through this kind of mass of data to try to understand which ones are relevant and which tweets you should code, right? But if you just use a hashtag for filtering, that might basically make it easier for you as a researcher, as a company to use. But then you miss these other conversations that are happening, and you restrict your data source to just a hashtag that might have one specific utility, or there might be a whole plethora of hashtags that are used to describe something. So for example, if you want to find tweets related to Occupy, it's not just one hashtag. There are a whole series of hashtags. Different spellings, different cases. But what I found helpful is that I was able to go from here are 300 million tweets a day, here's a set of 137,000, and then by using the idea of locality, keywords relatedness to Occupy, and also keywords for kind of requests for needs, I was able to eliminate a lot of that noise and then go down to about less than 400 hashtags. So I think that I didn't think it was possible before I came here, because I was like, oh, well, just use hashtags like everyone else is doing, because I wanted to be, you know, cool like everyone else. The other, but in this kind of practice and test, I was able to basically make it manageable to not be totally dependent upon hashtags, to be able to see kind of the conversation around a hashtag, and also find kind of other hashtags that were used for similar purposes. So, so finally, I want to say thank you for taking the time to be here this morning, and I also want to say thanks for all of your mentorship and friendship this summer. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Jeff asked me to make sure we use the microphone so we can catch all the questions. So let's open it up for questions, comments.
Can you talk just a little bit about where your coding scheme came from? I mean, it made total sense, but I'm just kind of curious, was it a bottom-up thing, sorting through the tweets that came out, or were you drawing on some sort of existing?
So the coding scheme came out of, it was more bottom-up. So in developing the coding scheme in consultation with my mentors, my fabulous mentors, I took, in reading the tweets for a set of keywords that I could use to search for and not be dependent upon the hashtag, I also kind of read for kind of what kind of categories of activity am I seeing, and then also drawing on some of the resource mobilization literature. So it's kind of a combination of those two to develop the coding scheme. And then also, and then there was some kind of consultation, and of course I wanted to have a large coding scheme and then narrowing it down to be appropriate within the time frame. So, so as a result of that, I ignored, and I maybe should have mentioned this, I ignored tweets that, since I was looking at goods, so perishable and non-perishable goods, so I ignored tweets that were asking for political change, that were announcements of events. So I just focused on goods as a way to kind of narrow the focus.
Thank you. I really enjoyed that. And in particular, I mean, I sympathize with a lot of the methodological problems you had, because we just wrapped some studies on the Arab Spring, and we're in the middle of doing another one and starting to play with some Occupy data. So we're running into the same problems. And there's the assumption that, I mean, we see Twitter and there's so much data there, and we have this fantasy that, it's so easy to play with it. And then you start getting your hands on it, and it's just like such a mess to organize and manipulate.
Mess is a nice way.
And I think there should also be like a term for graph envy, because some of these graphs are so beautiful and artistic. And I was thinking, especially some of the ones you started with, I was comparing them with some of the ones we have that are just kind of like, well, a little bit crude. I mean, I wish they were prettier. But what I wanted to ask, I have a few questions. The first one is kind of, I mean, it starts out as an obvious question. I'm curious, what do you think, I mean, the fact that the pizza requests emerged as the dominant way of expressing solidarity for the movement within this particular tag of needs of occupiers, what does it mean for, what does it mean for the movement in general? But I'm more interested, I mean, I don't want to get caught up in the conversation that has to do with like collectivism. I don't think there's anything wrong with collectivism, but rather I'm more interested in what do you think that does for the texture or the form of the movement as it compares to other movements that also became very vocal through Twitter and used Twitter to attain visibility. So what does this mean that, for this movement, this was a dominant form of support as compared to other movements like the Indignados movement? And I don't have any data on those, but my impression is that a frequent request in those movements had to do with medical supplies. For instance, the Indignados movement in Greece, because it was just very noisy in terms of its protests on the ground. And Spain a little bit, was characterized by requests for medical supplies. So what does that sort of, prompt for solidarity, for show of solidarity through food? What does that do for the texture of the movement, the Occupy movement in the U.S.?
That's a good question. Well, so first, I don't want to, so the pizza request in September, so you don't actually see requests for pizza in October anymore. So this was kind of the opening, this is kind of the entry into asking for resources. So you don't see the pizza request anymore in October, which is interesting. So they're kind of a transition of, it's almost like a dipping the toe in the water of let's ask for something easy, and then maybe more complex requests. This is just kind of me kind of pondering. So there's kind of a transition in the requests, like requests for clothing and those sorts of things are pretty constant. Just from my playing around with the data, requests for funds are somewhat constant, but the requests for pizza seem to be at kind of the start of the movement and then kind of fade away. There actually end up being a lot of complaints about people like, we don't want any more pizza, we can't handle it. But I think that I don't know, that's a good question. I think that's something I have to think about. I feel like that's hard for me to respond.
I don't know the answer either. I mean, it's a question that I'm playing with as well. I mean, I don't want to get caught up in these like meaningless comparisons of like all these movements that use Twitter. Yeah. But to a certain extent, I want to understand, how they use the platform, and then how the ways in which they use the platform combined with, sociocultural, historic context, specificity, to give the movement a certain thrust. It seems to me, like the Occupy movement had like this thrust in the first few months, and then it just sort of dissipated. And part of that, obviously, is explained by historic, economic, sociocultural context stuff.
Yes.
But, I want to understand like the very small percent of it that has to do with maybe how they used Twitter. So.
Well, I also think that part of it seems to be things that lend themselves more to the social media environment and requests and asks of, so there are requests for medical, but if you want to get kind of support on a global or national scale, how do you do that? And how do you show solidarity on a national scale when you're not on at the physical location or near the physical location? So, so you need kind of a repertoire of forms of solidarity that varying people can participate at varying levels. So maybe at one level, So maybe the generator's request, just kind of positing, might be the intention was that's for local people. They weren't asking for a generator from somebody from Seattle. Okay? But I don't know that. I mean, so I think I think it'd be pretty amazing to go back and talk to some of the occupiers. Also talk to some of the occupiers that retweeted a lot of this content or kind of some of these asks to kind of understand how they were thinking about it. Because just looking at the data provides with this kind of disembodied view of, I can say, here's what's happening, here's how this might fit in with existing theories, here's what they might be doing. But I think that it would be a pretty amazing opportunity to go and do some interviews, which if I had more time was one of the things on the table to kind of talk about. But I think that I think it's allowing people to show solidarity with varying levels of physical presence and varying levels of locality, I think is part of that equation somehow. If that makes sense?
Yeah, it totally does. I mean, I think there's something going on there with, this form of show of support, then fostering, facilitating local cohesion for the movement, but maybe limiting it in the sense that it doesn't allow it to gain more global support, attain more of like a cosmopolitan face maybe. But that's a big part of the structure of the Occupy movement, that it has this sort of like broken down local context. It has this locality about it. I have some other questions.
I mean, I think another thing that's interesting that's connected to that question is, so how do you determine if someone's a member of Occupy? What does it mean to be a member? And what does it mean to show solidarity? So is sending a pizza showing that are you a supporter? So I have some colleagues that have been doing a lot of interviews on the ground with occupiers in Seattle. And there's kind of this debate. They've asked people questions about, so is someone part of Occupy? What does that mean? And so some people say if you don't come to the camp, then you're not part of Occupy. Or so that's really interesting, because we don't have this idea of you're not like a card-carrying member of Occupy anymore. So the idea of membership is transitioning too. And so I think that kind of plays into this whole kind of complex kind of ecosystem, because when these boundaries are not as clear, so that makes this kind of more difficult to get at, I think.
So do you have a sense of who the people giving the pizza are, and is it the same group of people over time, or is it like one-off kind of donations?
It seemed that there are a lot of one-off donations. The propagation was happening. So if we go back to, I'll show you here. There we go. So if we go back, maybe. There we go. So if we go back to kind of this slide, you'll notice that there's no, my mouse is not going to, is it going to show up? All right, so I got to stand in front of this. So you'll see these kind of clusters, like this cluster over here. That's actually, that's not one of the Occupy sites. That's actually a Twitter user who propagated a lot of these requests. So propagation seems to be kind of a core group that propagates a lot of these requests. But in the kind of response saying I sent pizza, that it's not the same person sending pizza every single day. It's actually a bunch of different people a bunch of different accounts that are saying that they've sent pizza.
And these are people who are not part of the movement. They're like people at home.
I don't know. I mean, location in Twitter is dubious at best, trying to kind of understand that. I mean, because I could geocode their Twitter profile. I could see about their tweets, if their tweets are geocoded, but I still think that doesn't necessarily tell us the location, right? Because I could say I'm in Seattle, because my Twitter profile still says I'm in Seattle. But this summer, as you all know, not in Seattle. Right?
This is great. It was really fun to hear you tie it all together, having watched it unfold. But so I really loved the point about what local and national and international infrastructure was in place that enabled people to like deliver pizza versus deliver generators, and I think that has like a really nice explanatory power to sort of say it's really easy to deliver pizza because there's cheap, and I mean I can think of any relative, any place in the U.S. and pick up the phone and have a pizza delivered to them. That's sort of like a very straightforward activity, in that, you know, pizza places take credit cards, they deliver regularly, whereas like places that stock generators, that's not necessarily an activity that they take orders for over the phone or deliver. So I think that that sort of explanation of the banking infrastructure and sort of the local infrastructures on the ground is like, has a nice explanatory power for, yeah, why pizza, not generators. I also want to hear a little bit more about propagation, and in particular, the case of, am I right that the non-hashtag cases all had geocoded, all were geocoded for New York?
So by geocoded, that means they mentioned Occupy New York City.
Oh,
so I
okay.
use that as a form of, so a colleague of mine at UW, he's a critical geographer. So
Okay.
he's looking at kind of conceptions of geography that aren't just Latin long,
Okay.
or my Twitter profile says such, you know, when I mention a location in a tweet. So I use the idea of the mention of a hashtag or the mention of the Occupy New York City account
Okay.
as kind of pointing to that location and implying that that's probably relatedness to Occupy New York City.
Got it.
And actually, in my reading of the tweets, that actually worked.
Okay. Okay.
It probably threw out I mean, I narrowed it down so there's things that are happening around that, right? There's a cost, because again, I'm doing the same thing of, this is like a hashtag, but it actually worked fairly well.
Do you have a sense of whether some of the propagators were they like how local they were, or?
I did not look at any of the profiles, any of their profiles, so I don't have a good sense.
Okay.
So I can't really speak to that today. So that would be interesting to do.
Yeah.
So that'd be interesting kind of that'd be interesting possible study to do.
Okay.
You must ask one question before you leave. No.
Everyone
We all
has
have
to,
so
yeah.
many.
So many, yeah. So I was really curious about the whole point of where they have received the pizza and then they are kind of expressing gratitude for it, but then immediately turning it into another ask for something else. So I don't know if this is something that you could have seen in your material or that would have been happening, but did you see people critiquing that, where like the expression of gratitude turns into like something else instead of just saying thanks? So were people getting frustrated at all about that, or
You mean
and
people-
how do you
they-
think that would play out in like sustaining the folks in their motivation to contribute to the camp? Like if they feel like it's like they're never satisfied, they always keep on asking for more stuff. So
I did not see any of that in the data that I looked at. All I basically saw was a bunch of gratitude and no complaints. There were some news articles that I have that surround the kind of pizza phenomenon, where they claim that people are complaining about pizza and they want, you know, something else. I guess they wanted like Indian or Thai food instead for dinner, right? But they don't. I don't have anything that kind of confirm that. The only thing I have is some news articles that mention that. And then there's kind of the transition away from the discussion of pizza to kind of other resources. You know, so if you look at the expansive time between September to October, there's no mention of pizzas in my generator set, or in even the non-hashtag set. No one talks about pizzas anymore. And you know, Occupy is still going. The camp is still there. There are actually discussions of different types of food. Then it's like they've transitioned to, you know, they are using commercial kitchens to coordinate food. There are a bunch of local deliveries. There are discussions around food, about whether Occupy should or should not be giving food. The camp should be giving food to the homeless. And there are kind of some people complaining about, you know, this is our food, and then other people saying, hello, let's connect back to the values of the movement. Feed everyone. So that's actually what the camp did, is if you showed up at the camp, so like if you worked down the street, you could go eat lunch at Occupy, the Zuccotti Park every day if you wanted to. And from what it looks like, the food looked actually like it was pretty good.
Oh, sure. Could you go back to that, the last slide on the conclusion set
Sure.
of slides?
I'd be delighted to. Do you mean this one, or do you want the slide before that? You want this slide?
Wait, go to the last one. Yeah, for filtering. What, you know, I think this whole discussion of
using the hashtag as, you know, a way, like this organic way of organizing conversation is really interesting. And if you could go one back, actually, that's the one I was looking for. Especially when you talk about the hashtag becoming part of the infrastructure. I think there's a really interesting connection there between the idea of propagation, which, by the way, I think is, you know, is a really interesting way for describing this process of, you know, retweeting and echoing, sort of, you know, I think of it as kind of like creating a chorus of people that supports requests. And it's, even if those requests are not met with a response, the fact that there's this, you know, amplification of the request that's going on through the propagation is really interesting. You know, it adds a sense of constant movement to what's going on, and theoretically speaking, I think there's some really interesting ways of further exploring the connection between propagation and then the infrastructure, the discursive infrastructure or the conversational infrastructure that creates for the movement. I mean, we've been playing with that idea a little bit through the concept of framing. So we look at the hashtag as a sort of organic frame. So it's a way for people to set the frame for the conversation later on. And you know, be very vocal about establishing the fact that, you know, this is what the conversation is going to be about, especially in terms of how then mainstream media pick up on and report this conversation further. You know, so that's one way of understanding that. And if you look at it from a framing perspective, if you look at it as an organic frame, then I think there's some more recent research on this idea of cascading frames, you know, multiple frames that become activated. We're very interested in how cascading frames enable a networked framing process, but I think a missing part in that equation is that propagation term. I think that has great, you know, theoretical substance. So that's really not a question. I'm just I'm just thinking along. So
well, the other part is that hashtags co-occur. So you kind of build hashtags, and that by kind of connecting a series of hashtags, you build a greater meaning than kind of the individual hashtags, and that also connects to the text inside. So one of the things that I had played with a long time ago was looking at automated sentiment analysis in tweets, and it doesn't work very well, and it works it's poorly, even worse in the Occupy data set, because people will say, this really bad thing is happening, so I should support Occupy. So the majority of the words are negative, so therefore that gets coded as negative. Or there's sarcasm of, I woke up with 300 other people today, the walk of shame was not so bad. It's one of my favorite tweets of all time there. So something like that. I've not forgotten that tweet, apparently. So that would be that's negative, but that's actually kind of sarcasm and humor, and that's kind of an integral part of the framing of kind of Occupy and framing of participation, or why someone should participate. But then you kind of chain these hashtags together. So you have like needs of the occupiers. You might have a hashtag that indicates location. You might have another hashtag that would indicate relatedness to Occupy. Then you might have another hashtag, maybe that might indicate the weather, might indicate a date. So there are also event-specific hashtags within Occupy that kind of rise and fall. So you'll see like November 15th was N15 or 15N, depending upon if you're in Europe or the United States. But then that hashtag kind of peaks around the event, and then afterwards that kind of disappears. So the hashtags do combine to create this really interesting meaning and framing. And so they're kind of in like a Twitter shorthand. So that is a really interesting thing to think about, and how that kind of fits in.
So one thing, I really enjoyed your talk. Nice work. And I had a couple questions I wanted to ask to get people to think out loud with you.
Okay, yes.
But one that's not about that is,
okay,
what do you make of needs of the occupiers remaining intact versus being shortened? Can you theorize for us a little bit about what is it that resists the theory you have about syntax shortening as it goes?
Well, so, but if you think about all of the cases, so this is me theorizing off the top of my head. So if you talk about the cases of Occupy Oakland shortens to OO. Mm-hmm. Occupy Wall Street shortens to OWS. So does needs of the occupiers shorten to like NOO? So how does it shorten and also retain some meaning? So I think that might play a role in whether a hashtag gets shortened. It's like, how do you shorten it and maintain its meaning so it's not shortened into obscurity?
Can I play with you here? And I'm just realizing, because one of my favorite parts of your paper is thinking about the infrastructure that's already built that it's leaning against, and you just brought out for me how much those are locations. Those are specific sites that can, especially if we're thinking about the locality of the audience, can really rely on visualizing Occupy Oakland in a specific place. So if I shorten it to OO, I don't necessarily lose the richness of what I'm referring to. And needs of the occupiers is abstracted out from specific location or locality. So it's, I mean, it is and it's not. So I don't know, it's interesting to think of how syntax might change in relation to those questions of what's the infrastructure that a hashtag is leaning against, that might help us think about what are those resources that are otherwise somewhat obscured when we're just thinking Twitter. So that's...
Well, and also, do you want the hashtag to be recognizable by only your group? Or do you also want the hashtag to be recognizable by kind of a greater group that might be kind of entering that conversation? So then if you see, you know, OO, that's related to Oakland, but is that really important that people that might not know what that means for them to understand it? Versus needs of the occupiers, somebody sees that, oh, I understand, no pun intended, oh, I understand needs of the occupiers. That's related to Occupy, this is needs that they have. Versus if you shorten that, then do you kind of lose kind of some understandability?
So one question I had that I was hoping folks would be able to pitch in, what to do about quoting tweets and handles. So I'm thinking, you know, if this is a case where publicly, you know, when this gets published, and for this talk you've stripped out the handles, but even the tweets are searchable. So
yeah, some of the tweets I modified, but it'd be pretty easy for you to find them through a Bing search.
So I'm just wondering if people have suggestions for how to represent these materials without necessarily unduly exposing the folks who are circulating this information, because they do become somewhat exposed. And I can imagine, you know, I always have that image of if I'm the one if that's my handle and I've put a tweet out, how would I respond if I just saw that out of context in public, in a talk, or read it?
Well, there's also the assumption of, because I did not mark a tweet as private, therefore it's public and everyone can use it as they see fit to do whatever they would like.
Right.
Which is, I think, kind of problematic in our understanding of that's surrounding tweets, but that's also part of our existing research infrastructure of kind of the dance that we have to play as researchers.
Yeah. So
common practice is to rephrase them and in a way that it's impossible to search for it anymore, but you still maintain the same, like basically just replace words for synonyms and things like that, and then kind of also create fake usernames that also try to be as close as possible to the original one. But one thing that I found, at least when doing work with kids, for example, is that
we're not capturing this for posterity.
Is that a lot of people, like some of the people want to be quoted, so sometimes not quoting them, it's also, you know, something that they might not receive. Also, maybe it's also like a judgment call for you as a researcher, or you might even want to contact them. If you find a quote that is like amazing, maybe you want to tweet at them and say, you know, I want to quote you in a paper, is that okay? And that could be one way of getting away with that.
That really appeals to me for prosperity. Oh. That really appeals to talking stick. I know, it is totally the talking stick. That really appeals to me because I think in terms of setting practices for researchers who are dealing with what we do presume to be public tweets, you know, it's fair game. It's nice to propose a practice that's engaging the participants who are giving us those materials. So, you know, I can absolutely see with the ones that you pulled out, contacting the handle, whether or not you reach them is beside the point, but making that effort really kind of sets a standard for how should we be treating these as artifacts of social interaction and people's engagement with us. I like that.
Well, yeah, I think the idea of asking, and I've asked some other folks about this, and it seems that some folks that do larger scale Twitter research, the idea of asking this kind of makes their head explode in a way of, well, how could I ask 8,000 people? And I'm like, well, you write a program that processes 30 million tweets. Can't you write a program that lets people confirm that they would like to be part of your study or not, and kind of like an automated process? You know, why can't we do these sorts of things? I think part of it is just because we don't think about it, and then we don't. And it depends upon our kind of our kind of contextual understanding of privacy too.
I just have real problems with the idea that researchers need to be held to some extraordinary standard where public artifacts have to be personally approved when nobody else in the world adheres to that standard. And I often think that by reaching out and saying, I really want to quote this in a story, researchers are doing the disservice of perpetuating an illusion that people with the power to redistribute those voices are always going to come ask. And it actually is a private sphere where they don't have to worry about being publicized. I think that being quoted by a scholar in a paper is about the lowest impact public distribution you could have, and that by posting something on Twitter publicly, particularly in a context like participating in a protest movement that's in the news every single day, I just think that we're being silly at that point. And, you know, I mean, I'm sympathetic to the idea that people should participate in research knowingly, but I also feel like if you're I feel like researchers do a disservice, and we need to take that disservice really seriously also. I mean, you know, in the big picture, I mean, of course, there's going to be tweets where you probably the right thing to do is to seek. I'm sending pizzas, probably not one of them. You know, I'm considering slashing my wrists, probably is. You know, so I think that there's more contextual awareness that needs to come into that decision, but I'm concerned, and I've been concerned for a long time. You can go back through the ARL archives, and I'm like ranting about this stuff in 2002. I'm just concerned about there being some kind of collective delusion that researchers have that we can somehow keep people safe by asking for permission, and that what we really should be engaged in, we talk so much about amongst ourselves as a research community about how can we protect the people that we study. And a huge piece of that conversation is how can we educate them about the public nature of the media that they use and the ways in which those things can be appropriated by other voices. And so I feel like we sidetrack ourselves into thinking, ooh, this could be published in a journal that 1,000 people will see, instead of saying, hey, you do realize that a journalist can quote this and put it on the evening news, and they're never going to ask your permission. You do realize that pharmaceutical companies are mining all this stuff, and they know who you are. You do realize that marketers are sucking this stuff in and using it to target and profile you and connect that to every place else on the web. And then some dorky researcher comes along and goes, can I have permission to quote this tweet?
Wait, so
Myself.
Because I think, importantly, I totally agree with if it's motivated by the sense of protection, because I totally agree with that. I feel like the impulse that this is about protecting somebody's identity or making sure that they're safe or that they're not disclosed, that's not the motivation to me. The motivation is precisely to say, I'm looking at this material, it's publicly visible, I would like to use it in this context. And in many ways, it doesn't necessarily, it could be a matter of not asking permission as much as giving that notice so that someone is aware. I think that does become that moment where you realize, like, oh, people are looking at this stuff. Because I think often, at least in the research I've done, folks really aren't aware of who would be looking, because they're not really thinking anyone's paying attention. I mean, particularly for the youth I'm working with, they are and they aren't. So I think it's less about a motivation to keep somebody's anonymity for protection, and more of a moment of giving them the opportunity to participate in how they're circulated in a different context. Because I think it's one thing when it's on Twitter, one thing if it's on a Facebook page, but imagining if my starting point, and it's more of a question, if my starting point is a respect for you are publishing material, I want to use it, and without maybe a rights property model, but more of a, I want to create an opportunity for a different audience to engage it, like to draw them into that conversation. To me, it becomes part of educating them about, you do know that this is totally out there. But I see what you're getting. I mean, I don't think it should be, I don't like the protectionist move. I think that's, I mean, I particularly was thinking about Andreas's work when Sean and I were talking about this. I think there are places where giving somebody an awareness of their visibility could be really helpful to them. And in the long run, I think it's helpful to me as a researcher that I have the reputation that I am thinking about it. But I'll stop there. Other folks.
I mean, I agree with all of you. You know, I think it's a really complicated question. You can't really, I don't mean to be intentionally diplomatic. I just think it's a really complicated question. You have to have the training as a researcher to be aware of all those potential issues that could emerge. But then it's deeply contextual. Depends on who you're working with, what kinds of questions you're asking, what risks there are for your participants or your informants. How are you quoting? I mean, and what do you need to quote? I mean, have they said something that's really remarkable, or are you quoting something that's just sort of like, how you doing, misspelled, and you just want to use that to show how syntax, grammar is manipulated on Twitter sometimes. But it's important to, to discuss those questions and to be aware of them.
About 1 minute before we have to head up and get lunch.
I just last question. You mentioned the three different kinds of flows. Can you just speculate on how your study, just because I know you've been thinking about this, would have been different if you had used the search API versus the fire hose?
3 different kinds of flows? What do you mean?
Three different kinds of ways of accessing Twitter.
Oh,
tweets.
okay, got it. Sorry, I was thinking of flows as a different term. Yeah. So I'll bring up the slide because I feel like it. So, yeah. So I think that, I'm not sure, I think I'd have a different story. Well, actually, I couldn't do this using the search API. It's not possible because I'm standing here in August of 2012, and we're talking about going back to September and October of 2011. So the search API only goes back 8 or 9, anywhere from 6 to 9 days, I'm sorry. So that would not be possible. So there are a few places on the planet that have access to an archive of the fire hose. So the Library of Congress has an archive, which has not been made public, and in theory will be made public at some point in the future for researchers to use, but with a 6-month delay. And then there are a couple corporations and research institutions that have access to the archive. But there are only a handful of people that have access to that. So I think that for the hashtag that I was looking at, if I just looked at the hashtag data only, then I kind of was clairvoyant enough. So the problem is a lot of the social media research requires some sort of clairvoyance on the part of the researcher, or having someone like me sitting at my desk all the time, and then my advisor can call me or Skype me in my case and be like, "Oh, look at this hashtag now, do it." And then then they have like a minion where they already have systems in place to collect that data, right? So if I didn't. If suddenly I saw this hashtag, I didn't have kind of the technical skills to be able to figure out how to do the data collection, this project would have been a non-starter. Because if I'm not collecting it now, it's gone. This hashtag, needs of the occupiers, is something that's pretty low, it's low enough volume that it would have worked, but I wouldn't have been able to find the, using the search terms. I wouldn't have been able to kind of develop that corpus and then kind of go back to do the comparison just because of the way the APIs work. So that would have failed. And then the streaming API, there's no history.
Right. So you would have literally had to know the moment that it started.
Yeah.
And okay.
And what's also interesting is that for each of the APIs, when you submit keywords, or if you purchased access to data, so if there are a couple of data aggregators that you can purchase access to a subset of the fire hose. If you have mad cash, I'll say that. I've talked to them, and they're like, "We want X amount of money," and I said, "You realize I'm a grad student," and then we kind of said goodbye. And but if you put a keyword in each of these APIs, you'll get different results because they have different matching criteria. So also there's an idea of kind of comparability of the different streams. So when you put something in using like a commercial provider like GNIP, you get one thing. If you have access to the entire archive, you'll get another thing depending upon the kind of affordances of that search tool. And then the streaming API, it's actually not possible, or at least it wasn't possible, to construct a query using the streaming API and then construct that exact same query using a commercial provider. You would still get different data. And also, in talking to some of my colleagues that do this research, we're thinking about doing some comparisons, is that even with different connections to the API with the same exact search terms at the same exact moment in time, there's like a 1 to 3% variance between those data sets. So part of that is thinking about, well, maybe you collect from 5 different locations and then you kind of combine all that together, because Twitter is this black box still. We have to kind of trust the minimal amount of documentation that's available, which has been getting better. So if anyone from Twitter ever watches this, thank you. But until recently, there wasn't a list of all the fields that are available in the tweet. So actually, on a side note, I'm diverging, but I think it's important to know, is that when you get a tweet from the streaming API, it comes with anywhere from 50 to 150 fields of metadata about the tweet itself. And then there are a couple of publicly available tools to help researchers collect data, but those tools you only get like 3 or 4 fields. You get like the text of the tweet, you get the user ID, when it was posted. Those are important, but then you're missing all this other metadata that you have. So and some of it's, I think, pretty important. And there's also kind of a creep factor too about what you know about someone. So like every time Mary tweets, if I'm collecting that data and the words of her tweet, or I'm following Mary, they kind of match, then I know how many followers Mary has at that moment in time when she tweeted. I know how many tweets Mary's had. I know what her location is, what color you've chosen for your background, what your pictures are, all your location information, any geolocation information that's attached to it. If you retweet someone's tweet, then I know all of that about the retweeted tweet too. So it's important to kind of think about how all that would fit together when you create a study, and about kind of what information you would access and why they match. But to go back to your question, sorry, and my kind of divergence, is that it wouldn't have been possible for me to use a search API. And if I had the clairvoyance to collect the data at the time, then I would have been able to collect the hashtag data, but then the development of keywords, that would have been much harder with the search API, to kind of impossible. Because I can't collect 100-some-odd thousand tweets in a day with the search API. You can collect about 6,000. And there are a lot of duplicates in that. Because every time you ask for it, it doesn't go, what have I given you? It gives you whatever is kind of convenient to the server that you ask the data from.
Okay, I think we need to stop. Thanks, Sean Walker.
Thank you.